Hello and welcome everyone. It's great to have you here with us for our webinar on reframing childhood adversity, promoting upstream approaches. My name is Amy Templeman, Director of Within Our Reach at the newly merged Alliance for Strong Families and Communities and Council on Accreditation. The merged Alliance and COA will convene and catalyze a dynamic, inclusive, multifaceted network of human social service organizations that leverages the collective experience of the field and research to spark a current in the sector and propel continuous evolution and improvement. We are also deeply committed to improving broader systems so people have what they need to thrive. Today's program is co-hosted by 3 organizations, the Alliance COA, Prevent Child Abuse America, and the Frameworks Institute. Understanding the need for fresh, powerful framing strategies, the Alliance COA and Prevent Child Abuse America asked the Frameworks Institute to update framing recommendations that have served our field well since 2004. The result is a new strategic brief that is highly accessible and actionable, takes recent science and current communications contexts into account, speaks more directly to racial and social justice, and aligns with efforts to reimagine child welfare systems into child and family well-being systems. The brief gives us tools to reframe childhood adversity as a solvable, preventable, and public issue. I've seen firsthand how helpful framing guidance can be. In a previous role, I served as executive director of the Commission to Eliminate Child Abuse and Neglect Fatalities. Our task was to deliver a report to President Obama and Congress in 2016 with recommendations to address these serious issues. As I'm sure you all know very well, it can be challenging to engage people in a conversation about the urgency of preventing child adversity without also turning them away out of sadness, fear, or discouragement. This may be the same reaction that some of you experience when telling people about the work you do with children and families. The common response I hear when I talk about our work is, "Oh, that must be hard," which can be true sometimes, but this work also gives us tremendous reason for hope. Framing guidance helped the Federal Commission call for a collective responsibility and describe how child abuse and neglect is a solvable public health issue, and we know what works to prevent it. We named the Commission's report Within Our Reach to emphasize the hope in this message. Today, Within Our Reach is an office at Alliance COA that promotes the Commission's vision of a 21st century child and family well-being system where everyone has a role to play in strengthening families. We are fortunate to work with the Office for Victims of Crime at the Department of Justice to implement the Commission's roadmap in 5 communities through a 3-year national demonstration initiative called Child Safety Forward. And we are grateful for DOJ's support in the development of this new reframing brief as a resource for the demonstration sites and the field. I'm pleased now to introduce you to our partner in this work, Dr. Stacy Phillips. Stacy is a victim justice program specialist in the Office for Victims of Crime at DOJ. Stacy, thank you for your support and for being here with us today.
Thank you, Amy, so much for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for being with us today. It is great to see so much interest on this new guidance on reframing adverse childhood experiences. When OVC designed the Child Safety Forward demonstration initiative to address reducing child fatalities and serious injuries from maltreatment and victimization, we knew that communication would be an important piece of that work. The 5 sites are designing communication strategies that engage the broader community on issues such as safe sleep and protective factors, reinforcing the concept that the entire community is responsible for child and family well-being, not just individual families or individual agencies. Especially as the sites share what they are learning with the field, we will all benefit from using these framing recommendations that allow more people to connect with equitable solutions that promote safety and support families. The message that child abuse and neglect is solvable is also aligned with OVC's work with Alliance for Hope International and Dr. Chan Hellman from Oklahoma University's Hope Research Center on Hope Science. Hope is the belief that your future can be brighter than your past, and you play a role in creating it. It refers to our ability to develop pathways or mental strategies that will help us achieve our goals. Research demonstrates that hope buffers adversity and stress, it predicts important outcomes, and it can be learned and sustained. It is a protective factor. And we know that shame and blame is not the pathway to healing. And our language around this is critical and of continuing to evolve. The science and power of hope as a driver for prevention and intervention is grounded in evidence-based research. It is measurable, malleable, and offers a compelling response to ACEs. The research is clear and convincing that hope is the mindset that drives resilient behavior. At this point, I would like to introduce my colleague, Jennifer Jones from Prevent Child Abuse America, where Jennifer is the Chief Strategy Officer. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Stacy, and thank you again for your generous support of this work. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Jennifer Jones, and I am the new Chief Strategy Officer at Prevent Child Abuse America. Prevent Child Abuse America is the nation's oldest and largest organization committed to preventing child abuse and neglect before it happens. We promote policies, programs, and resources informed by science that enable all kids, families, and communities to thrive today, tomorrow, and for generations to come. We are incredibly excited to partner with Frameworks Institute and the newly merged Alliance for Strong Families and Communities and Council on Accreditation on this updated Reframing Childhood Adversity framing brief. We are incredibly thrilled to have so many of you joining us today. In fact, over 3,100 people have registered for this event. We knew this was important work, but you are showing us in numbers just how needed this is for our field and how hungry we are for framing strategies informed by science so we can communicate the importance of preventing childhood adversity and bring new partners and champions into our work. In 2004, with funding from Doris Duke Foundation, Prevent Child Abuse America commissioned Frameworks Institute to compile a report titled Making the Case for Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention. That report helped shift the field from talking about vulnerable children to a brain development frame and has been used widely and broadly over the years. It has moved the field in tremendous ways, including in policy wins, shifting political will, and improving child outcomes. A lot has happened since then, and a lot has changed in the science and the prevention field, including how we talk about child development, adversity, and well-being. So PCA America joined forces with the Alliance to update the 2004 Prevention Framing Brief so that all of you and other child welfare and prevention advocates are equipped with the communication strategies you need to effectively advocate for your programs and policy changes at the state and local levels. Our vision is that this takes hold in the field and all of you join millions of others in continuing to shift how we talk about child development, childhood adversity, positive childhood experiences, and hope. We would like to challenge all of you as you listen to Dr. Sweetland to think about how we do things differently and how we engage others, expand our partnerships, and ensure these recommendations are brought to life in all of our work. So our messages from California to Montana to Vermont to Alabama are common, strong, and unified. It is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Julie Sweetland. Dr. Sweetland is a sociolinguist and serves as a senior advisor at the Frameworks Institute.
Thanks, Jennifer, when you come back, and Amy and Stacy, and thanks to everyone who made the time out of all the responsibilities you have to take some time to think about how we frame this very important set of issues. I'm representing the Frameworks Institute today. We are a group of social scientists who convene to figure out the communications challenges of important scientific and social issues. And we've been working in the early childhood space since we began in 1999, and I'm delighted to have the chance to speak on behalf of the colleagues and the team here that did this work today. We heard a couple shout outs to history already on this call about the framing that has served the field recently, but I just want to point out that the children's movement, the child welfare movement, has always used strategic framing as one of the tools to drive change. In the 1860s, as the very first child protection services were being imagined, those women leaders framed this issue, framed child abuse as a moral issue, which was part of really unseating the social norms of how children were treated at that time. Fast forward to the 1960s, people intentionally framed it as an American issue, connecting the issues of child welfare and child well-being to the issues of the day. The future of the nation and American strength, connecting that to childhood experiences. And in order to move it into a policy space, that framing intentionally led the changes to Social Security that for the first time had funding designed to address child poverty and establish child protection services in every state. And as you all know, in this work from the late 1990s to now, there's been an intentional effort to frame child adversity as in the body, right, as a biological mechanism that affects longer term health and social outcomes, really connecting it to public health outcomes. And so framing is always important right now, as the earlier speakers mentioned. It seems like we're in a moment to reposition childhood adversity again. We have reached a point where people understand that abuse and neglect are unacceptable and that there are other forms of adversity. That's seen as important, even a bipartisan issue, but the solutions seem not within our reach, but always over the horizon. It's seen as intractable. There's a real demand right now to rethink the way we do things because of that, and to look to strength-based and more justice-oriented approach to how we support children and families in adverse situations. And there has been such an explosion of research that has added a lot of lenses, a lot of on the work, from trauma to adversity to ACEs to structural racism, all of these different ways of looking at it. And that has strengthened our case, strengthened our research base, but it has also fractured and fragmented our framing to some extent. So what we hope to accomplish through this is to really ensure that we are setting up the solutions as prevention, and have effective ways to make the case for bold change, and to coordinate our language at some level. If we don't share a frame, we are splintering or diluting our effect, and ultimately undermining each other and ourselves and the cause. So as we sat down to think about this, we established a few goals. The field that's working on childhood adversity is large and vibrant and complex, and so it has an equally large set of communications needs. We didn't set out to address all of them. We focused on these. We think it's important, we at Frameworks think it's important to really broaden the public's mental model of childhood adversity, make room for a more expansive definition as we talk about as what counts as a serious problem. We think it's important to expand public understanding, not just that there are many problems, but how those problems occur, help people take something like a social determinants of childhood adversity perspective. Wouldn't recommend that language, but that's the kind of idea we want to move into public thinking. We want to shift attitudes that will affect this issue's place on the public agenda. Namely, we want to elevate cultivate the sense of collective responsibility, it's on us, and the sense of collective efficacy, that can-do spirit. If we do something, it will make a difference. This isn't just kind of a fool's errand. And with that motivation and to act, we want to shape understanding of the solutions we want, right? So really building support, cultivating more conversation about upstream approaches, by which I mean getting folks like the people on this call to use less of our communications real estate to talk about problem, and more to really emphasizing solutions, particularly prevention and promotion. And to do that, we're doing that. We want to invite the field to consider changing the way they talk, because that's going to change what non-specialists hear about the issue and what they think about it. We want to increase support for strategies that enhance primary and secondary prevention efforts and approaches that really promote broader community well-being. And so to arrive at a strategy for doing this, thanks to Prevent Child Abuse America and the Alliance and COA, we were able to go back through our database on framing children's issues, one of the world's largest databases on how Americans think about children's issues. So some of the data that we pulled on was foundational. Many of you are familiar with the ideas the framing strategies we've developed in partnership with the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child. So framing strategies like brain architecture or toxic stress, but some of it is newer. We turn to the findings of, for instance, a series of focus groups that we ran just before the pandemic. These included Black adults who described themselves as having experienced significant adversity in early childhood. And we looked at how they responded to and resisted messages about ACEs and toxic stress and trauma. We brought in some of our findings from our just released research on how to frame adolescent development. And there, a lot of that story can be similar to what we can talk about in early childhood, but there are some important differences as well. So this was really a reinterpretation and synthesis and updating and bringing all that research to bear on this topic. Back up. And what we landed on is that it's important for the field to talk in ways that make it very clear that childhood adversity is a public issue, that it's a preventable problem, and that it's a solvable problem. And so we will, through the course of this webinar, I'll go through these different strategies underneath those three big ideas that we think are important to advance. Before I do that, I want to just say one more word about what this strategy is and isn't. So this is an approach to focus on explaining child adversity. It will be best for coordinated, we want to focus, our goal is that folks like those of us on this call are more effective and coordinated in shaping the public conversation about what childhood adversity is and why it matters. So it's a framing strategy for explaining it, making it common sense that we as a society can prevent most instances of child adversity from ever happening in the first place, and that when adversity does occur, we can prevent a traumatic event from compounding and cascading into other problems. So it's framing advice for outreach to possible allies and bystander publics. It's about how to expand the constituency that believes that solutions are within our reach and worth reaching for. And it's advice that will help to attract potential champions for the issue. Because of the way that Frameworks goes about testing these framing strategies, we feel confident that these recommendations are reliable guidelines for that type of work. It's not messaging for clinical settings or clinical interventions, working particularly with families who have experienced adversity, and it's not necessarily ready to go language for oppositional or political settings. And it's not plug and play, take it off the shelf, turnkey messages already tailored for varied audiences or channels. So to put this another way, I'm about to walk you through a set of high-level framing recommendations, and I'll give examples of how that recommendation might shift the approach to a particular piece of communication. I would assume that everyone on this call, all many thousands of you, should be able to apply the recommendations, that higher level recommendation. The example may or may not be the type of messaging that you need or the style that would work best with your audiences, but the strategy overall should be pretty applicable across folks. So without further ado, how is it that we could start to talk about child adversity as a public issue, as something that doesn't affect only the people directly involved in the incident, but it has a broader sense of a broader sense that it's something that we all have a stake in, all have a responsibility to work on. The first important part of this, and we heard this a lot at the beginning of this call, is modeled beautifully, that we need to consistently talk about child adversity and child maltreatment in ways that really emphasize shared fates, and making the story one where we all have a stake and a role in outcomes that matter. We need ways to remind people that we all benefit from child well-being, and we need to show that the consequences of child adversity are likewise shared. So to do that, it means that we need to change, I think, some of the ways we are accustomed to talking about these issues. So too often our stories, with the very best of intentions, are about children's fates, as if they are disconnected from society as a whole. We tend to emphasize the scope or the severity of the problem, highlighting bleak facts and upsetting stories in order to spark action based on compassion. The problem with this framing strategy is often as not, it primarily resonates with people who already agree with us. That kind of story might generate short-term attention or interest or even outrage, but it won't build a constituency who's in it for the long haul of overhauling our systems in ways that focus on prevention and promotion. So instead of telling a story about kids, we need to tell a story about society. It's not about them only, it's about all of us and the principles that we should uphold. Our sense of right and wrong are really powerful motivators. And when we tap into that sense of right and wrong, but connect it to a broader goal or a longer term aspiration, we give ourselves room for bigger, bolder changes. So we all have a stake in ensuring that children reach their full potential, that their talents and skills are available to our communities. We have a collective responsibility. Instead of saying we should be compassionate for children in these situations, more about not who's affected, but who's responsible for taking action. And that's us. We all have a collective responsibility to children. We all have a role to play. And what we do with that role can maximize or undermine children's potential. So here's some examples of what that might look like in some short, crisp messaging. 2 examples of leading with values. When we lead with values, we spark a more productive perspective. So we suggest human potential and collective responsibility, because these have been shown to have positive, statistically significant effects on attitudes, on public attitudes and previous frameworks experiences. So human potential in particular really boosts support for social services and family supports, and collective responsibility is particularly good at increasing people's sense that child welfare is important and that action is necessary. So leading with these instead of the name of the issue, like child abuse, child maltreatment, child adversity, sets us off on a more aspirational goal, which again gives us that longer term view. So here's what this might look like in terms of shifting a little more specifically. So instead of focusing on their vulnerability, here this message is focused on generating a negative emotional response, sympathy for victimized children, fear of what might be happening to children now, and using that emotional response to generate support for this proposed solution, which is services for abused children. So again, that formula might motivate people in the short term. It might generate a donation or a vote or for a particular program or policy. But over the long term, an over-reliance on abuse and neglect as a frame narrows the kinds of solutions we can push for. We can only ask for solutions that seem to fit the problem as we've defined it. And here we've defined the issue as the horror of abuse, and then protective or punitive policies follow from this. So to break out from this, we need to widen the lens on the issue. We might use that aspirational framing of our responsibility and potential in order to do that. And then we can really get into why we need to make bigger changes in order to promote that potential and live up to our responsibility. So an example here is to talk about how children are filled with tremendous promise. We have a shared duty to foster that potential, and that means shoring up the ways we support families. That allows us to really get into some of these higher impact policies like increasing economic supports. I'm not saying we have to stop mentioning the problem of abuse or neglect entirely, but it shouldn't have pride of place, right? It's really, we're in this to foster and protect children's potential. That means we have to do X, Y, and Z. That will not only reduce abuse and neglect, it will increase kind of overall well-being. That helps it be framed as a public issue. Another piece of doing that is to really show how external conditions get under the skin to shape health and development and outcomes. We need to locate the issue in those external conditions in order to set up the need for a broad policy response. And we know right now that the mechanisms that perpetuate childhood adversity are largely invisible processes. It makes it harder for people to see the underlying causes that drive the problem. And we need to help people see them, because if we fail to explain them, how one thing leads to the other, people fill in empty causal slots for themselves. And on children's issues, people usually fill in a story about the individual flaws and failings of parents. And on issues like structural racism or poverty or economic inequality, people fill in a story about individuals or communities failing, not policies or systems, and they blame the people themselves for disparate outcomes. But if we can offer careful explanations, we can overcome this built-in tendency to reach for familiar answers and prompt people to pause and rethink their understanding of how something works. When we take the time to show the link between a root cause and its visible effect, explanations can lead people to recognize broader impacts and see why certain solutions lead to meaningful change. So telling this contextual story, to do this well, we want to be sure that we are connecting broader forms of injustice, such as economic or racial inequality, to childhood adversity. We want to be explicit that the stress of discrimination or repeated, just kind of repeated experiences of discrimination can wear down a caregiver's capacity to tune into children's needs. We want to connect the dots between the aspects of structural racism that are familiar to the public, such as police violence or lack of access to quality housing, and the ways that those experiences can hamper safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. So that getting a really much, connecting to the other social issues of the day is one way to talk about this. In doing that, though, it's important, I think, that we keep something that has worked very well for the field, which is to tell a neurobiological story, keep it in the body and the brain, and not a psychological story, social norms, psychological mechanisms, for instance, social norms that promote violence or social learning of abusive behaviors. Those references are much more likely to reinforce people's tendencies to attribute responsibility to individuals. And so keeping it in the body and the brain is an effective strategy. And then finally, we want to tell a contextual story, but we can't, it's better to explain one thing well than to try to say all of the things that are driving childhood adversity. So we think that we should not, don't try to include every source or type of adversity in a single communication. This is a longer term strategy, and in a given communication, it's better to do one thing well than it is to try to list, rely on lists, which are quickly forgotten. So here's another way to look at this. I've got here two versions of infographics, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with from our wonderful colleagues at the CDC. Many of you know these as the ACE pyramid. Both of these, the title is The Mechanism by Which Adverse Childhood Experiences Influence Health and Well-Being Across the Lifespan. So these are about a mechanism, and both of these are, of course, coming from the CDC, valid and sound from a scientific perspective, and they do a wonderful job of helping us understand what affects what. It's really important to include mechanisms. But from a framing point of view, If we think about these layers as the links in an explanatory chain, and that each link is going to shape the way people think about this issue, we might make some different choices. So starting the story, starting the chain, just with adverse childhood experiences really locates the problem in the home. You know, and that awful phrase and the unfortunate phrase of family dysfunction that really brings in that story of it's a problem with the people, right? Not a problem with the conditions. So that issue is recognized, and I think that's the genesis of the pyramid on the right, which has the longer term, deeper, you know, the roots of it in how historical trauma it gets and other forms of oppression get built into our bodies that can shape social conditions and local contexts, which can foster adverse childhood experiences. So it really goes deeper. But here I'd worry about some of the frame effects of the tip of the pyramid. If we're focusing on on death as the thing we're trying to prevent, that is depressing or seen as you know, not really going to eventually be successful. It's framing the problem as very big and serious and weighty in a way that might cause people to turn away, and really looking in at the adoption of health risk behaviors. Again, that might be a good strategy to pursue in your work, but from a communications point of view, it really, again, it reinforces a tendency to blame and stigmatize. So if we were to offer some framing pyramids to really, again, get external out, connecting external conditions and how they get under the skin. We can think of a negative one, a loss frame that focuses on negative impacts, and a gain frame that focuses on kind of the positive impacts of doing, you know, getting things right. So really starting and locating your story in unjust or unfair practices and policies, past and present, showing how those shape stressful and harmful conditions, which can spark child and family adversity, which can disrupt brain development, lead to social and academic challenges. And the ultimate loss there is lost potential, right? So this is a frame, a way to tell that story. On the positive side, if we can talk about the positive policies that we want to put in place that are more fair, more just, more supportive, that's going to create shared well-being. What does that mean? Well, now we have children who are growing up in responsive and stimulating and supportive environments. That will lead to sturdy brain architecture and strong skills at the early age. It's important to shift to thinking about healthy identity and readiness for adulthood for older children. What do we get from that? We get you know, greater social vibrancy, emotional skills that are great for work and life, and academic potential fulfilled. That leads to broader well-being. So that's the kind of translating the science into ways that make it a public issue. We have located the root cause in our public policies. That helps to make it a public issue, but it still stays with the neurobiology so that we are not, we are at less risk of talking about issues in ways that spark stigma and blame. All right, so an example of what that pyramid might look in messaging. On the left here, we have a pretty typical piece of advocacy communication that focuses on the disparities that we see in child abuse and neglect fatalities. Kind of lists the predictors, right? The kind of associated characteristics. Social isolation, young or single parents, parents who struggle with mental health issues or substance abuse or domestic violence, and lack of parenting skills. So those are all of our associated factors. Many of those you can see are more psychological in nature, lack of parenting skills, and all are mentioned in ways that don't really tell us how those things happen, what's causing those things. And so it's easy for the public to take away, this is a lot of, you know, kind of broken people. And then there's the statistic that African-American children are 2.5 times more likely to, or 2.5 more times more likely to die from abuse than children from other ethnic backgrounds. So I would just be concerned that people would walk away with the idea that that the problem is about bad people or broken people. But if we tell a story, again, that connects the social causes to social conditions, to the biology, then we have a place where people can see where we would intervene, and that it's not about fixing the people, it's about fixing the conditions. So here's an example of that. Starting right off with, our policies can help to create the safe, stable environments that children need to thrive, but instead they're often channeling serious stress into certain communities, which undermines child well-being. For example, and then we connect housing policy to current where folks are likely to live now. Black families are less likely to live near good jobs, more likely to experience pressure from either low wages or long commutes. This can get built into the body. Chronic stress can spark a toxic stress response, which increases depression and anxiety or other causes of child neglect. And it's this cascade of consequences from policy to parenting. And that means that when we work on racial equity, we also create communities that are stronger and are less likely to experience abuse and neglect. So shifting away from the stark statistic and the list of predictors to, again, that pyramid or that cascading set of consequences that starts in our policy context and ends with a loss of potential for the community. All right, so that's making it public. It affects us all, and it starts with policies. It's preventable. Prevention is genuinely hard for people to understand. Its effects are abstract and absent. It's a problem that didn't happen. Also, the effort that it involves just goes against the grain of the human brain. Cognitively, we have a built-in tendency to prefer rewards now over delayed benefits, even if that later prize is bigger. We default to focusing on the here and now, even though we all have a desire to leave a positive legacy for the future. So just our brains are built in ways that make prevention hard to take action together before it's too late. The good news is that framing can help short circuit some of the hardwired cognitive biases that make us less likely to act before a problem occurs. So every social movement needs a good sociolinguist, as my grandma and your grandma always used to say. So here, some of the things we can do are surface level changes, linguistic changes that can make a good amount of difference in helping the concept of prevention come alive. So if we can use language that really gives the sense that prevention is real and happening now, to borrow a phrase from our friends in the climate action movement. So here, none of these are major framing shifts, but every little linguistic bit helps when it comes to getting people to focus on the connections between now and later, which is what you need to do to mobilize and motivate preventative action. So we can use explanatory examples, really offer concrete examples of what prevention looks like in action, memorable, relatable stories that show a prevention effort at work, and explicitly explain the active ingredient or the mechanism that makes it work. We can replace bland process verbs with punchier, more vivid action verbs. So we often, when we're describing how prevention works, we often use verbs that signal kind of a slow, gentle, or indirect process. So we're ensuring, we're encouraging, we're educating. But I think we could lean toward more vivid action verbs that signal the action, help people see that the action you're proposing is time bound, it's lively, and it's direct. So we can tackle things, we can launch, we can equip. So just more vivid action verbs. And we can use when words to help focus attention on the present. Signal that prevention is in progress by using adverbs and adverbial phrases like now, right now, currently, today, which is much easier if you are telling stories of prevention that's happening right now. So really all of this are ways to get us to focus on the act of prevention and a little bit less about the benefit being far off, and convincing people the benefit will happen eventually. Rather, what's happening right now? What are we doing? Tell me how it works. What's the process that makes it work? How does it work? Not convince people that it works, if that makes sense. And then another thing that can help is just varying our vocabulary. Prevention is people don't understand it. And so they get the concept, they know the vocabulary word, but they don't always see exactly what that would look like. And so if we can swap in synonyms and sayings for the standalone term prevention so that we're not overusing it, that can, again, do a little bit to help. So we can talk about getting ahead of issues or steering clear of problems, or setting ourselves up for success, those kinds of aphorisms or phrases. In terms of more major framing strategies, I think it's really important to, if we're going to talk about this, the effects, if we're going to talk about childhood adversity as preventable, but also that the effects of adversity, if it occurs, can be changed. It's really important that we emphasize the dynamism, the changeability, the mutability of development. So a great thing about talking about child development is that it helps to create a sense of urgency. It emphasizes, right, the time-sensitive nature of our work. When we point out that children and youth are developing rapidly, and we explain how the experiences at each stage have an effect on what happens next, really, as I think you've all experienced, really can get people to say, okay, we need to act, and we need to act now. But there are some ways in which we talk about development in ways that don't keep it dynamic, that don't keep open the possibility of change. Sometimes we leave the impression that the past is set in stone. And I think that some of the excellent and amazing science and graphs on the dose response relationship of ACEs, right? The more ACEs you've experienced, a person's experienced, the more likely they are to have these outcomes. That framing can help to, it makes clear that early adversity has lasting effects, but it also can suggest that negative outcomes are inevitable or that the harm is irreparable. So I think some of the ways that we frame the dynamic nature is really important. We should talk about, how it's easier to get things right the first time, but there are always things we can do to step in and shore up anything that has been eroded or harmed. So an example to talk about development as a more sensitive and dynamic process. Instead of just really telling people that bad outcomes are ahead, really emphasizing the fact that the trajectory, it starts, but that it can be changed, right, by intervention, by attention. Instead of our field always and only talking about early, it's really, I think we have the science is clear now that we have multiple moments of possibility for change. So yes, early matters, but there's a sensitive period in adolescence when the brain is being actively rewired. And for new parents, right, the science around the openness of the brain in early stages of parenthood. So really talking about those multiple moments of possibility. And then also, frameworks have been quite consistent and adamant, I think, in really focusing on the brain. We want to update and extend that advice that if we're talking about early childhood, yes, the brain and keeping it in the brain and talking about how it's built from early experiences is absolutely your best frame forward. When it comes to adolescence, we have found in our recent research that talking about the brain too much gets people to focus really narrowly on things like, are they going to be good at the SATs, and are they going to get into college? So really cognitive academic outcomes. We have found that talking about adolescence as a time where children are exploring, taking on roles and identities, and they need kind of support and support in taking those risks and maximizing those opportunities is better. So I'll point you to that research, but given that so many forms of adversity, bullying, sexual abuse, many of these sorts of things do happen, intimate partner violence do happen in adolescence. The childhood adversity field needs ways to talk about adolescent experiences. And so that is maybe the brain frame is not as useful for those settings. All right, so in emphasizing the dynamism of development, we need to strike a kind of balance between showing that the effects of childhood adversity can be serious and long lasting, and showing that we can make a difference. And so this interplay between the toxic stress response, which does help us show that the impacts are long lasting and severe, but also buffering, right? This idea that a supportive and responsive adult or other experiences can buffer children from the impact of even serious adversity, and it interrupts that stress response before it turns toxic. So keeping those two things together is also an important piece of emphasizing the dynamism of development. All right, one more example before I move on to the next part. So we can, often when we talk about ACEs, we feel the need, I think at least I feel the need sometimes, to take people all the way back to the original study and make sure they understand every detail of it before bringing them to the point, right, of the proposal that I have, the thing that I want people to take away. I want to liberate us all from feeling that we need to teach every bit of the original amazing work, and therefore liberate us from framing like this, where we list all 10 of them, and talk about how many negative outcomes they've been linked to, and then somewhere we heard that we shouldn't be too negative, so we throw it on the end. There is a protective factor, right? It's these safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments. That is all accurate. It's all true. But it is not the most effective way to get people to see that ACEs are preventable, and that the effects of adversity need not be irreparable. So how could we shift in ways that help us, again, keep it a preventable problem? So this is reframing it with the dynamism of development and showing what happens. So ACEs are common and harmful. They include things like, and here I've just mentioned a couple. I chose two that seem to be more people can see, understand how they are preventable. And then talk about when children experience multiple negative events like these, their bodies can be flooded with stress hormones. So keeping it in the body, which sets the stage or increases the risk for later health problems like heart disease, diabetes, or depression. Now, but I've given almost a third of the space here to, the idea that stable relationships with supportive adults and keep the mechanism in there can buffer the children from this toxic stress response, which is why family well-being programs and policies are also health policies. So here what it's done is really talked about how it gets into the body in the early stages that can cause a longer term biological problem, which creates health problems. But back in that original moment, there's something that we can do. All right, recommendation 4, again, to keep it preventable. It's really important that we, to get at prevention or to get to prevention, we have to consistently advance the idea that social conditions and contexts shape family life and children's experiences. If people persist in the assumption that the problem all comes down to poor choices on the part of families, it's hard to see where prevention would make a difference. For example, we all know that the public thinks of child neglect as just insufficient attention and assumes that that problem boils down to either selfish parents or distracted, overworked parents. This perspective makes it hard for people to see how child neglect could be prevented. So we really need ways to get to that, again, that social determinants of child abuse and neglect or other child adversity. We need a way to get into the social conditions. The metaphor of overload can really help. So we can use this metaphor of just, I'll give you just a moment to read it while I take a breath. So we can use this metaphor of being overloaded to describe families experiencing significant stressors like financial insecurity, housing instability, or hunger. And you can talk about the solutions you're proposing as ways to lessen the load or manage the weight. We found that the metaphor of an overloaded vehicle works really well to focus people again on those social drivers of abuse and neglect, rather than a specific instant of maltreatment or the particular people involved. So it helps people think systems, not individuals. And we also found that the metaphor of an overloaded vehicle works really well to focus attention focus attention on how things like poverty, social isolation, or behavioral health conditions can contribute to neglect. Those are things that you can put on to the vehicle. So when we tested these, this metaphor really gave people a way to think and talk about the connections between social conditions and childhood adversity, not in a way that made it automatic, if poverty, then abuse, but as one factor that can contribute and a way and something that we could do. It gave people to think about way more factors than they might mention otherwise. So employment, transportation, healthcare, right? It had a sense of how all these things shape children's environments. And it really boosted people's sense that the problems could be prevented. There was something about the discrete nature of putting things on and off that helped people believe that prevention was possible. It's not solve poverty, it's take this weight off of families. So it was particularly effective with parents who had experienced child adversity themselves, because it gave them a way to think about the causes of their parenting styles without shame, guilt, or stigma. So I really want to recommend this to you all as a shared metaphor that has a lot of flexibility to it, and I think can be applied to many different issues. Here's an example of how it might look. Give you a moment to read the blue side. Okay, here we have defined technically, right, the parameters of neglect. And named some of the predictors, right? The things that make us understand the factors that are associated. And then mentioned some direct services that can work. We haven't said how they work. On the right, we talk a little bit more about we use this metaphor of overloaded, but also remember the metaphor is it's a metaphor for the broader social conditions that make abuse and neglect more likely. So we start with children can only thrive if they have regular interactions with responsive, caring adults. So placing it again in that interplay, what is driving development? And that's why it matters that neglect is the most commonly reported form of child maltreatment. Child neglect is a signal that families are experiencing an overload of stress of some kind. Now here you could put in, if you you could talk about many different types of stress. You could talk about behavioral health conditions. You could talk about social isolation. You could talk about discrimination that attends to LGBT families or other groups. Here I chose to talk about the weight of poverty or depression, especially can overload parents' abilities to provide the supportive relationships children need. Our responsibility to children includes a responsibility for fair wages, access to healthcare, and other essential building blocks of well-being. So I framed the issue, the drivers, like the things that contribute to it, as poverty and depression, and then the things I want to take, the way we're going to take that off is fair wages and access to healthcare. So thinking about, again, those factors that are stacking on and weighing them down, and how we can remove those sources of stress. All right, so we've gone through public, we've gone through preventable. We also want to talk about solvable. We really need to highlight the idea that our response to adversity matters. If our frame doesn't intentionally and explicitly show how positive outcomes can be achieved in the wake of adversity, people are going to fall back on the idea that once a traumatic event has taken place, the die is cast, and where it lands depends on the individual. People will easily conclude that programs and policies are beside the point because some people are going to just overcome the difficulty through willpower, so they don't really need help, and others will be irreparably damaged, and nothing we do will make a difference. But conversely, if we can really move away from a narrative that revolves around how the past predicts the future to one that focuses on how our present affects the future, our present actions affect the future, we can build the sense that we can do something. So one thing to do that, one way to talk about this is a solvable issue, is to lift up the capacity for resilience. We should not talk about the impact of adversity without also explaining people's capacity for resilience. We have to avoid giving the impression that adverse experiences early in life automatically translate into negative outcomes. I mentioned that before, but here I want to talk about really keeping the focus on how to counterbalance the weight of adversity by explaining the concept of resilience as, positive outcomes despite negative experiences, and help people see how resources and experiences really shape and promote resilience. So we want to show what interventions at the individual, family, and community levels look like, or lift up community strengths and assets as important resources for building resilience. But the idea is to just keep this sense that counterbalancing the weight of adversity means we can tip the scale towards positive outcomes. So let's take an example. Let's look at an example of what this might look like. On the blue side, this really does use this kind of formula that if we've got kids plus adversity, we're going to have negative outcomes. So if they're exposed to adversity, they often develop these challenges. They can be irritable, depressed, or have difficulty sleeping or concentrating, which is more in that psychological realm, and may struggle with school or act out. And then if nothing breaks the cycle, these patterns may continue on to adulthood and even be passed on to their children. But don't worry, there's something vague and jargony we can do. On the right, this is really talking about how we have a responsibility to respond. If we take that responsibility, we offer an effective response, the outcome is resilience. So this first sentence works to position resilience as a possibility that society needs to support, not a responsibility that communities themselves need to shoulder. So when children and youth experience serious adversity, like witnessing violence, we have a shared responsibility to buffer the impact. One innovative approach involves having pediatricians have a conversation with families about things their children have experienced. So this is the idea of ACEs screening, but in plain language, non-scary language. If there's a need that they have, doctors can connect them to resources like family counseling. The idea is to add positive supports that counterbalance the weight of negative experiences. So I hope that this, you can see I'm signposting here, right, how it works. What's the process? What would we do? Well, we'd change the way doctors run their visits, and we would make sure they can connect people to the right resources. That's what makes that protective factor of assessment and intervention work. And it helps people really visualize what that approach would look like in practice. And I hope that this avoids language that suggests or allows audiences to assume that the onus of resilience lies with people who have experienced significant adversity. Instead, I tried here to be clear that resilience is the result of positive supports and protective factors, which happen in the context of some kind of policy or investment in communities. Again, this is just one example. The broader idea is to really talk about resilience and how to promote it. All right, my final recommendation is to always include a promising or proven solution, policy level solution, something that we can do to improve the situation. When it comes to childhood adversity, especially abuse and neglect, the communications challenge isn't so much to convince people that a problem exists, it's to convince them that we can do something about it. When we make it clear that change is within reach, we ward off fatalistic thinking that assumes that we can't prevent or reduce childhood adversity. And when we highlight collective policy level solutions, we make headway toward redefining the problem. This approach shifts the focus from individual responsibility to our shared obligation to set up fair structures, effective systems, and equitable social conditions. So to do this, we want to propose actionable, concrete solutions that match the scope of the problem. So, and we want to infuse that not just in one little sentence, right? Not one little sentence that seems like a throwaway at the end, but infuse a solutions vibe throughout our communications. So we want to signal that solutions exist in multiple ways. Our tone and our word choice and our examples should all work together to create a sense that change is both necessary and possible. So we, no more starting off our stories with it was a dark and stormy night or da 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 da, but the good news is, right? It's a kind of a sense of we have a serious problem. We also have some serious solutions within our reach. It's important that we calibrate the solution to the problem we've defined. So I pointed out earlier how if I located the problem as depression and, problem, depression, solution, healthcare, right? That you want to kind of have a tight logical flow. And also that the sense of solution, the level of solution matches the kind of level or scale of problem as you've defined it. To do that often, it's also important to not just list several solutions, assessment, intervention, treatment, but showing how solution was, telling solution stories a little bit so that people can grasp how they would make a difference. Here's an example. On the left, we have here a lot of energy going toward getting the audience to acknowledge the awesome enormity of the task. To ward off the worst, we have to ward off the lifelong toll. We have to dismantle everything, the norms and environments that devalue children, perpetuate violence, and we have to tackle poverty. And we can do that if only we fix politics. Good luck with that. I will be off onto another social movement that has a prayer. But on the right, that framing gives us a sense this is too much. It's just too much to take on. On the right, there's more of a balance between problem and solution. Policies that strengthen family financial security can go a long way toward reducing childhood adversity and enhancing the relationships that help children thrive. So I'm not promising the sky. I'm saying we can go a long way toward this goal if we take on this one discrete policy area. And then I give a how it works. When families face financial hardship, it sets the stage for more stress, less tuned in interaction. Well, if we can boost family incomes, we can relieve the pressure, helping to head off childhood adversity before it happens. So here I explained how it works, which boosts the belief that it can work. And not just a list of all the solutions we could have, but again, one explanation of what it looks like. All right, that is the end of the recommendations that we have outlined. I think I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Charles, have I stopped sharing my screen? And now, and turn it over to Jennifer, who will lead us into the best part, which is the question and answer session.
Awesome. Thank you again, Julie, for all of your amazing work in providing us with the framing science that's so needed and so important, so that we can continue to advance our cause by talking about it in the right frame. I've actually had the honor of working with Julie over the past 6 years. I'm a huge fan of her work and certainly that of frameworks. And I'm sure you all are now too, if you have not been already. I also just want to say thank you for all the great comments and resources that you all are posting in the chat box. We do have some great questions from the question and answer box. If you have any questions, please post those in the Q&A box. It's kind of hard to keep track of all the comments coming in the chat box. So Julie, I'm going to go to some of the questions that have come in. And the first one is, I was struck by your comment that having a new infant at home is also a sensitive phase for brain development. Can you comment a little bit more on that and the implications that this might have for home visiting?
So I am a framing expert, not a home visiting expert, but I became aware of that research through our friends at Ascend at the Aspen Institute. I know they have at least one wonderful resource on that. I think it's called 2 Windows of Opportunity or a second window, something along those lines. I will look it up and be able to share that, but that is some of the emerging research, and it does have, I think, great implications for really thinking about the role of young adults and thinking about so if the brain is open again at that point, it is open for it can be rewired in very helpful ways. So greater executive function and those sorts of things, or it can be overloaded with stress, right? And all the things that we know that comes from that. So it really does make the case for greater attention to parents in the earliest phases of parenthood.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And I would just point out that's Dr. Sarah Watamura's work. She's been doing a lot of work with the Aspen Institute as well, and showing that the brains of parents, not just the mother, but in some cases, the father's brain or other caregivers' brain changes as well. So here's another one that came in, Julie. How do you integrate the racial context of our country, both in the US history and in how child protection and related systems operate? The frames seem race neutral, but systems obviously don't operate in a race neutral way. So this beyond speaking to racial disparities as an issue area, but across all the frames.
Sure. So I don't see these frames as race neutral. I do see them as ways to make the case for a society where the systems work for all of us, and to say that the systems are not working unless they're working for every community. We spoke directly to, in a couple places, I wanted to model ways to really point out how the policies that we have adopted, from housing to employment to education to everything, right? I think I selected housing in particular, but really locating the work in those historical, past and present, unjust and unfair policies and practices, and how that shapes communities, how it channels stress into some communities and keeps it away from others. So for anyone who is working on really taking a racial equity lens to the work of reimagining child welfare systems, I hope that these recommendations offer some ways to have those conversations and to push those conversations forward. One thing we have found in raising the role of history, that is very important, not jumping over history, particularly of things like the history of the child welfare system. But it is also essential to have at least one contemporary policy or practice that shows that legacy is continuing. So just saying, kind of that it's rooted in the past is important, but it's necessary, but not sufficient. We need something that is closer to now for people broadly to see that we need to have a solution that really tackles disparities. So I hope that helps. It's a great question. It's an important question. We could probably have a whole nother brief on framing the intersection of race and childhood diversity. But I wanted to also have a broader lens for this one.
Great, thank you so much, Julie. So here we have several more here. So I'm just going to keep reading them. I noticed that you use the term child adversity. Can you share about the shift from child abuse? I think you touched a little bit upon this, but if you want to just add a few more thoughts here.
Sure. So I think child adversity or childhood adversity. I don't have a strong feeling about child or childhood, but adversity gives us more room. It is a broader umbrella concept that allows us to build in many different forms of bad stuff that kids face. That is important because to get to the big high level prevention policies, we need to locate it again in those social conditions and structures. And so the umbrella lens, the umbrella frame of adversity lets us talk about a broader range of issues, make the issue bigger. It's certainly fine to mention, right, that abuse is one of the forms of adversity. I don't mean to suggest that abuse is a term we should all give up or never talk about again. Certainly not. But the issue at the level of defining the problem, the problem is not abuse. The problem is children in relationships and environments and conditions and structures that dampen their potential. And so at that level, that's one of the ways it lets us talk about racial justice. It's one of the things that lets us talk about economic issues and employment issues and schooling issues and all these things that shape children's lives. So that is the framing reason for it. The science is taking us there. And then in terms of the policies we can ask for, that higher level frame gives us more room to ask for bigger, bolder changes.
Great, thanks, Julie. So previous frameworks briefs have advocated for the value of prosperity. For example, the toxic stress brief.
Yeah.
Was there any reasoning to move away from this value?
It's a little tricky, I think, okay, if you are only talking about just child development for its own sake and you're not getting into this issue of adversity, I think prosperity can still work as a value frame. We don't have any evidence to suggest that it doesn't. There's something a little inapt, like a little off kilter about talking about bad things happening to kids and then going to money, right? It just it doesn't seem to be as at a messaging level, it felt clunky, right? To kind of make that link and that bridge. We have very strong evidence that human potential works on the kinds of policies that are those upstream policies, and that the child, the other one, is losing it right now. The collective responsibility is particularly helpful, right, for bringing it back to us. So for bringing it back to, we all have a responsibility to deal with this issue. Much less paternalistic than, say, protection, for instance. So it's really more about the specificness of this intersection of kids and adversity that it was about prosperity not working in general.
Great, thanks, Julie. So what would you think is the biggest new updated recommendation from the earlier research that we all did in 2004? Are there things recommended in earlier framing toolkits that we should adjust or change based on these new updated recommendations?
That's a great question. I think the story of resilience and the story of resilience as the outcome of the positive factors we add to communities, I think that is, I don't think that was really firmly present in that work in 2004. The science was just emerging at that point. So I think that's really important. I think the overall strategy that we recommended at that time about, was really to shift from an abuse frame to a development frame, and to get inside the body, get out of the experience of abuse and into what that effect has on the body. That's still there, but the idea that we need to link it much more closely and intentionally to social injustice and policies that drive and shape inequitable conditions, I think that's the other big shift. I don't know, Jennifer, what do you think?
I also agree that it's a great question. I think the overall, the way you presented it in the 4 or 6 framing recommendations, I really loved the work too that you did on prevention and how we can talk about prevention differently. So, or not differently, but some of the linguistic strategies that you include. I think that's really important. I just loved it all. I think there's a lot here that we can use and do. So thank you for throwing that back at me, because I hadn't really thought about that. So Julie, here's another one. How are we translating this model to the adults who are living with ACEs, not just early adversity, but addressing trauma across the lifespan?
Yeah, it's a really important issue. It's not one that I have a huge evidence base to really speak to. So that was, as I said at the outset, this is for that outside game, right? For shifting public opinion and mindsets in ways that allow us the political will and space to create more upstream solutions. It may or may not be effective for the direct services work. That said, the one thing I'd point you to the brief that we put out recently on talking about toxic stress with families, and that recommendation of being sure to keep agency in the picture, right? It's not all social conditions and human, individuals have no capacity to change their own situations. That was really important in talking to adults who had experienced adversity. And the capacity for resilience, so that the typical charts that show that dose response relationship. That is not the best frame forward for working with people who have high ACEs. The sense that these things do have an effect, and there are things we can do now to build your resilience. That pairing was really critically important with that group. I bet there's somebody on this call who has a lot more experience and expertise in the best ways to, again, talk directly with folks in clinical interventions to boost that hope. So,
thanks, Julie. And actually, to go back to your last question, one of the things that I thought was also one of the little nuggets in the report that I think is also useful was how you sort of address this idea of a public health approach. And you comment on that. I think our field has really been using that quite extensively. So can you just say a couple of things to that, or speak to that, and how you address that in the report?
Yes. Americans have no idea what a public health approach is. They might have a little bit more of an idea this year than they did last year, but even then they are thinking of it as a whole lot of medical care, right? Everywhere, and not, we are going to collect data, understand a problem, really target our responses to necessary areas, think about the policy context that's creating risk factors or removing them, right? The true, have broad strategies that work across a population. That kind of thinking is really not present in the general American mindset. So saying a public health approach is sort of like the same as saying nothing, I think. And we get so few opportunities to shift public understanding on these important social issues that we have to make the best use of every moment we have when we have the public's attention. So similar to how I recommended explaining and using sayings, right, to talk about the word prevention, I would rely on the phrase public health approach very little and spend more time explaining what that means. One metaphor that we've recently developed and tested and proved effective for people for the concept of public health was to talk about it as the foundations of community health, and then talk about the things that do that. And then the work of public health is to check on the foundations, strengthen the foundations, shore up the foundations and everything. So it goes very well, I think, with the building metaphor that we've talked about, building well-being, but it's a little bit of a different metaphor, and you can find that work on our website.
Great. This is kind of a long question, but I think a very good one. So my observations is that this is a very positive approach and very upstream, and it's a good start, but should be acknowledged as broad. My analogy would be that infection is an adverse health experience, and hand washing and social distancing are important public health approaches to containing it. But the approach to bacterial infection, strep, for example, must be different from the approach to polio or COVID. Similarly, addressing adverse childhood experiences broadly without dealing with and specifically using words like sexual abuse, physical abuse, and emotional abuse as individual causes of health and mental health conditions with downstream preventable health consequence is the next frontier. How would you frame that work?
Oof. Can I see that? Can I see it? That's it. Okay. So
yeah.
The heart of the question is about the limits of using an umbrella concept of adversity and not getting into the specifics. Is that the heart of the question?
I would say that it's broad, and how we treat things like, for example, strep would be different from how we would treat something like polio or COVID. So I think the analogy is similar. We might addressing childhood experiences broadly without specifically talking about sort of sexual abuse, physical abuse, and emotional abuse as individual causes.
So I think that might be the difference between a high level frame and specific messages for specific contexts. That might be part of the answer to that, or how to think about both of those things. It is broad. This is recommending that the field broaden beyond child abuse and neglect, which I think for a large part it already has done. And then it broadened beyond ACEs, even that, and that because we cannot solve those problems without getting at the larger structural conditions that keep ACEs happening. So to get to the solution, we have to be able to address racism, poverty, sexism, economic inequality, and we can't address those issues without having ways to talk about those issues. And child adversity lets us nest all those things. So that's one reason to go broader. The other thing is there are not as many moments when you, for the public, when it's helpful to get into a very discrete issue. The level of support that we need is higher than, or broader than, I need this particular thing to change the way we're doing reporting around sexual abuse or something. So what do you need from the public, which is a general sense that, what kids are up against when kids are facing adversity, that affects us all. That's a public issue. We can prevent it. There's actually something we can do to stop that from happening. It's not inevitable and it's solvable. Even if it happens, we can do things and address it afterwards. So that's the level of story that I think the public can handle. I'm not saying we shouldn't continue to have discrete, targeted, evidence-based solutions for particular issues within childhood adversity, but I think the bigger story is going to get us bigger results.
Thank you, Julie. And I think we have time for one more. So here we go. For the impacts of supportive, responsible adults, how do you share that without having the audience fall back into assuming that it is the role of the parents to be that adult, or that only parents can fill that role?
Great. So this goes back, I think, to what was Jim's question. He said, what would be changed from other toolkits? One thing I would keep from previous recommendation is to expand the role of caregivers. So to really be intentional and disciplined, and I see this all over the field, where people say parents, teachers, coaches, early child care providers, aunts, uncles, grandparents. So it doesn't matter really who you put in that list, but you really need to talk about children and the adults in their lives. Name parents, because if you don't name parents, people are like, what about the parents? But always extend that list. And that makes it clear, not just extending the list, but really emphasizing that it's the process, right? It is that back and forth, stable, caring, responsive relationship, not something that just, is abstract, like love, right? And so the sense that you need to focus on the process, not the characteristics of the person so much, is another important piece there.
Thank you again so much, Julie. This is an amazing piece, amazing framing brief. I know we are already thinking about intentional and strategic ways that we can use it in the context of our organizations, and certainly how we can get it out to the field and to our chapters and our Healthy Families America site, so that everyone, again, as I mentioned earlier, we can create a unified common message that we're all using. So thank you for your work and for your time today. Before I turn it to Amy for some closing remarks, we would like each of you to open the survey link that we will post in the chat box and offer us your feedback. It's really important. Your comments will help us improve as we continue to share and apply this work. So please do open it and please complete it today. So I will turn it over to Amy.
Thank you, Jen. And thank you, Julie, so much for all of this incredible work and for your presentation today. I want to thank everybody for joining us for this webinar. We really hope that you are leaving with some new ideas about ways to frame childhood adversity as a solvable, preventable, and public issue, because now more than ever, It is important that we all do our part to promote supportive services that strengthen families, and that includes the trusted, community-based child abuse prevention programs such as home visiting, community and parent cafes, and family resource centers. We have posted some resources for you in the chat box and hope that you will be able to subscribe to the newsletters that we produce, including the Within Our Reach newsletter, and follow our organizations on social media. Most importantly, please continue to engage with us and share your experiences as you try out these new recommendations. We're really hoping to create a learning community or a community of practice around them. Today's webinar has been recorded and it will be distributed after the program. Thank you all so much for being with us, and thank you for the work that you do every day to support children and families. I hope you all take good care.